How's it going guys, Chris here, and in this guide we're going to be taking a look at all those freaky enemy types and bosses found roaming the foggy streets and grungy corridors of the Silent Hill 2 remake. So Silent Hill's not exactly a place you'd want to wind up in, with its supernatural aura manifesting people's inner demons into, well, actual demons, taking the form of physical monsters which haunt them in the town's warped reality. The first and most common enemy our unfortunate protagonist, James Sunderland, is going to come up against is a twisted creature called the Lion Figure, basically walking lumps of meat wrapped up in fleshy straitjackets and body bags. The Lion Figure is a physical manifestation of James's subconscious, generated from memories of his sick wife in the hospital, represented by the monster being trapped in its own body, squirming around in discomfort as it pukes up gushing streams of infected liquid, symbolising his wife's illness and death, along with James's feeling of being restrained. These things typically stumble around the place looking like they've had a few too many Jaeger bombs, and because they're smothered by their own skin, they've got very limited vision, often allowing you to slip past them unnoticed. When they do catch onto your location though, you can expect them to become hostile, swinging their meaty bodies around and barging into you to deal damage. With these things practically being wandering chunder fountains, they're also going to spew deadly vomit all over the place too, giving them extra range as they shower you in that acidic bile. Nasty stuff. Lion figures might seem a bit slow and clumsy, but they become a whole different beast when they decide to crawl around on the floor, scurrying across the ground at rapid speeds, being much more skittish, unpredictable, and generally unsettling things to deal with, using hit and run tactics as they rush around the area. They are a bit more vulnerable on the ground, open to getting stomped on, but this lower profile also lets them hide out of plain sight, wriggling out from underneath cars and furniture, giving them new ways to strike from the shadows. Speaking of striking from the shadows, one monster that absolutely loves jumping out from dark places and giving your heart rate a good jolt is the Mannequin. A creepy thing with 4 slender legs, sort of resembling 2 female fashion dummies stitched up together. These mannequin creatures also derive from our main character's psyche, symbolising the prosthetic devices used in his wife's hospital, along with James's repressed lustful urges and frustrations during the time that she was hospitalised. They act in a very different way to the lion figures, often choosing to act like inanimate objects in the environment, eerily standing around corners, crouching down underneath furniture, and generally being less obvious things to spot as you navigate through the pitch black rooms of Silent Hill's interiors. This makes them very effective at ambushing their targets, especially with their presence not generating any static on your radio, letting them stay incognito until they reveal themselves. If you get too close to one or shine your flashlight on them for a bit, the mannequin's going to come alive and clamber its way towards you, attacking with jabs and lunges, lashing out with those dangling legs. They can be pretty dangerous things up close, having fast attacks and agile movements, able to jump around and evade your melee strikes. But they don't really have any ways to take you on over range, hence why they like to use the element of surprise. Obviously, it can be a good tactic to gun the monsters down before they manage to pounce on you, and shooting them in the legs will cause them to stumble over, letting you finish them off with your melee weapons while they're temporarily out of action. Aside from all those disturbing monstrosities that haunt Silent Hill, the town's also home to a giant angry beetle called the Creeper, a fairly normal looking thing in comparison to the other nasties you'll face, but still something that will hunt you down relentlessly nevertheless. Creepers aren't actually connected with the psyche of James, but are actually lingering creatures, first manifested by Alessa in the first game, still generated from the town's supernatural aura. They're pretty big for beetles, but still very small enemies in the grand scheme of things, able to be smushed in the blink of an eye by simply giving them a good whack up close. It's not always easy to see them coming, mind you, being rapid little buggers that scurry along the walls, seemingly popping up out of nowhere at times, rushing in to give you a painful bite. Blasting them away with your guns is a good way to waste ammo, being awkward to hit due to their size and speed, though they're probably the least you'll have to worry about, just so long as you can time your melee swings right as they approach. So those lion figures are pretty awful abominations, but there's an even more grotesque version, which attacks you with increased aggression and just simply can't stop being sick everywhere. These extra spicy variants are mainly found in the game's other world areas, being covered in bits of tape while having a much darker, grimier appearance overall, looking like they've been dunked in a bathtub of oil. Of course, this is down to the monster violently spewing up acidic bile all the time, with it literally pouring out of the creature as it comes shambling over, trying to put you within range of its puke sprays, generally preferring to take you on from afar. Those vomit strikes can hit you over a further distance, with the monster practically firing that caustic liquid at you in some of its attacks. And although they are fairly weak enemies that can be wiped out in just a few melee swipes or bullets, doing so will cause them to burst into a shower of that nasty fluid, in one last ditch effort to try and take you down with them. This can obviously be very problematic in confined areas, but it also makes the monster deadlier when it's overwhelmed up close, forcing you to dive out of the way before it self-destructs, while avoiding the dangerous pool of black acid, which lingers around on the floor for a short while afterwards. Now, it wouldn't be Silent Hill without creepy nurses, being one of the town's classic enemy types, appearing here in the form of the Bubblehead nurse, first encountered, unsurprisingly, in the dark corridors of Brookhaven Hospital. It's easy to see how these things derive from James's subconscious, with the obvious heavy symbolism of hospitalization. But these nurses in particular wear swollen masks, which look like they've been filled up with liquid, representing suffocation and drowning, doomed to suffer underneath their babyface masks as they violently twitch and judder to try and shake them off. They'll act in a similar sort of way to a typical zombie-like enemy, shambling around in a slow and eerie fashion, though they'll definitely pick up the pace a bit when they realise that you're nearby, aggressively charging forwards, armed with a long steel pipe as a weapon. Bubblehead nurses might not have any fancy tricks up their sleeves, but because they move around in a fairly erratic way, clumsily stumbling around and swaying from side to side as they pace towards you, this can make them trickier to hit with your guns, not helped out by the fact that they can also soak up more damage, and hit you with more punishing attacks nearby, as they try to whack you in the face with that pipe. Because of this, aiming for that bubblehead is usually going to be a good idea, especially when they're standing still, though just like with the other monsters, shooting the legs can also be another effective tactic too, knocking the nurse down, thus allowing you to finish her off with some melee combat up close. But aside from the classic Bubblehead nurse, we've also got the slasher variant to contend with, typically found in the Otherworld areas, being one of the game's more menacing enemy types. They look very similar to the standard nurses, but just like the dark variants of the lion figures, these things are also covered in tape, bandages, and black gunky liquid, now swapping that steel pipe for a much deadlier knife weapon, giving them much more brutal attacks if you let them get within stabbing range. Having that inky appearance lets them blend in a bit better with the dark grubby environment, and they'll generally act more aggressively towards you, chaining together quick slices and lunges, being much trickier to read, being faster and less predictable. Slasher variants therefore shouldn't be messed around with or taken lightly, potentially being a bit of a nightmare if one of them manages to get the drop on you, not only withstanding quite a lot of damage, but also able to counter your own melee strikes in hand-to-hand combat, making them even more ruthless in those tight claustrophobic rooms. Obviously shooting the head and legs is advised, but don't shy away from using that shotgun either, as blasting the nurse away and expending a shell or two would be far better than getting hacked to pieces by that nasty blade. When in doubt, whip out the big guns. One of the most bizarre creatures in Silent Hill, which is saying quite a lot considering the nature of the place, is a mangled up monstrosity called the Flesh Lip. And lucky for you, you just so happen to be locked in the room with the bloody thing. Hanging down from the ceiling by an arm protruding from the top of the monster's body, the Flesh Lip is basically a sack of swinging meat, encased in a rusty metal cage, with a creepy mouth situated on its underside in between a pair of dangling legs. Pretty wild. This is the first creature to have a visible mouth up until this point, and it's the one to essentially kickstart James's memory of verbal abuse from his wife, being another thing that torments him alongside his feelings of confinement. Playing out like a mini boss fight, Flesh Lip's going to keep climbing up into the ceiling, only to burst down from the roof and smash into you from above. You've got to keep an eye on the tiles shaking around, which indicates the monster's whereabouts, and get ready to dive out of the way as it swings down for another destructive kick. Being guarded by that cage, you've got to shoot the hand holding onto the ceiling supports, forcing the Flesh Lip to come plummeting down to the floor, slowly wearing away that metal cage protecting it. But lo and behold, that cage is actually part of the monster itself, with its four edges transforming into limbs when they're broken, acting as deadly weapons that can be jabbed forwards. Once the cage has been totally busted, and all four of those long metal limbs are out to cause some havoc, phase 2 of the fight is activated and the Flesh Lip becomes a hell of a lot nastier, with those metal beams acting like spider legs, clambering around and violently slashing away at you, using a variety of spinning attacks and far-reaching strikes. It's a lot faster, angrier and more relentless now, but it's also a lot more exposed, being a much squishier target than before, unprotected by that grid-like mesh. Now you'll be able to fill the monster up with hot lead, and you'll need to bury quite a few bullets into this thing to eventually put it down, being one of Silent Hill 2's more memorable encounters, and definitely one of its most unsettling. Another enemy type you'll run into, or run over in this case, is the Mandarin. A weird creature that typically hands down from mesh grating floors, stalking and attacking you from underneath your feet. Basically the Silent Hill equivalent to a sloth. Mandarins are pretty freaky things with elongated bodies, long stretched out arms, and multiple mouths, two of which replace the monster's hands, and are used to hold onto the gratings which they dangle down from, personifying James's feelings of anguish and helplessness, with the creature being trapped below on the verge of falling into a dark abyss. Despite usually having a floor to separate you both, these monsters can still be very dangerous, moving around quite quickly underneath your feet, obscured by the darkness as they hunt you down, shooting out a long tendril if they get too close, which jabs you to inflict punishing amounts of damage. They're not exactly the easiest enemies to spot either, so you're best listening out for their movements, and be prepared to dodge that dreaded tentacle tongue if you happen to get within striking range. Though if you want to get rid of them for good, you'll need to fire away at those mouth hands, causing the creature to lose its grip and plummet into the shadowy depths below. It's worth pointing out that not all of the Mandarins you'll encounter are suspended over a black pit of doom, with the ones later on in the game being on your level, using the ceiling to travel around on. They're a lot more threatening here, lashing out with tongue attacks and slams, sort of acting like mini-bosses, with them having such high health pools. So probably the most cursed thing you'll see today, our next monster is pretty much the stuff of nightmares, and if you thought those mannequins were creepy, their wall-crawling spider variants definitely take it up a notch. What makes these things so unsettling is how quickly they can move around, scurrying off into the shadows only to re-emerge from somewhere else. Kinda like when you find a spider in your bedroom, it always becomes a much worse situation if it suddenly disappears. These things scramble around on the floor, jump all over the walls and ceiling, and pounce on you from the cover of darkness. And despite looking similar to the regular mannequins, they're also going to act very differently, striking from unexpected vantage points rather than playing hide and seek. That doesn't mean these creatures will be easy to spot though, often chilling out high above your head, waiting for you to wander on by, being out of plain sight. I guess you could consider these spider mannequins to be the ultimate hunters, having both stealth and speed on their side, making them tricky enemies to locate and trickier enemies to actually shoot with your guns, with them running around all over the place, usually being backed up by a few buddies, just to make you even more uncomfortable. Thankfully, it won't take too much firepower to actually bring them down, but all those erratic movements might cause you to waste a bit of ammo in the process. If you see them standing still, give them hell. Probably the most disturbing monster you'll face in Silent Hill 2 isn't actually developed from James's subconscious, but instead comes from another character you'll meet called Angela, a distressed woman you'll run into a few times, who's also summoned to the town trying to find a missing mother. Both of your paths cross and realities merge later on in the game as you venture into the depths of Angela's dark memories, picking up the pieces from her backstory as you travel through a maze of claustrophobic hallways and rooms, resembling her childhood home as a place of imprisonment and torment. It's here where you'll be met by the abstract daddy, a twisted amalgamation of two figures lying under sheets of skin stretched out over a large frame trapping them in place. A warped manifestation from Angela's mind, expressing the past trauma and violations she suffered from her abusive father and brother. The monster's going to relentlessly chase you down along narrow corridors, smashing into the walls and destroying them as it desperately tries to get close. You don't really want that to happen, of course, as it'll force itself onto you and basically squeeze you to death, reflecting the horrors Angela endured, unable to escape from a place of spiraling destruction. After surviving the creature's advances, gunning it down while avoiding its charges, it'll keep retreating and re-emerging along your path, eventually leading to a loud, dark mechanical room with the walls plastered in human flesh, more symbolization of the monster being like an emotionless, heartless machine. Here you'll get your chance to finish the thing off in a hail of gunfire, while dodging its quick dashes and lunges, aiming for its squishier back whenever you can to dish out maximum damage. Not the trickiest boss in the world, having fairly predictable attacks, but easily one of the series' most sinister creatures overall, manifested from such cruel and immoral events. So far, all of the enemies and bosses have come in the form of messed up creatures, but there is actually one human character you'll need to deal with, a mentally unstable, depressed guy called Eddie. After running into Eddie a few times, you'll learn that he's not exactly great with people. Severe bullying and rejection has really damaged his self-confidence, giving him a lot of trust issues. But he's not quite as innocent as it first might seem, often found near dead bodies, which we can safely assume that Eddie murdered with his revolver. He's determined to kill anyone he thinks is making fun of him, and seems to have lost his sense of morality, blinded by anger and revenge, which isn't exactly helped out by the town's powers playing on his insecurities. This makes him a really dangerous and unpredictable guy, which you'll come to witness firsthand as you step into his frigid otherworld, painting you as his next target, believing that you're also against him. His fight takes place in a frosty meat locker, with the environment representing his cold, callous nature and lack of remorse, as the swinging lumps of meat set out in rows symbolise equality in death. Also looking like overweight bodies too, as if the room itself is trying to mock Eddie's physical appearance. A big game of cat and mouse ensues, with you constantly being stalked and shot at, while using the hanging meat carcasses for cover. He'll keep repositioning, occasionally rushing in to pistol whip you in close range, but the majority of his attacks will come from a distance, having 6 rounds to fire at you in between his reloads. Obviously, you'll need to shoot him back in self-defense, using audio cues like footsteps to keep track of his whereabouts, but he does like to make things trickier for you, by cutting the lights, meaning that you'll really need to pay attention to any sounds that he makes, along with activating the machines, causing those meat lumps to shift around, forcing you to keep moving with sight lines constantly changing. Eddie's surprisingly quick for his size, and he's also very accurate with that gun, but hitting him enough times will end the shootout and cause him to drop to the floor. Kinda tragic in a way, though he did take joy in shooting a dog, so I guess you shouldn't feel too bad for the dude. Everybody's favourite executioner is up next, with Pyramid Head, aka the Red Pyramid Thing, being one of the most iconic horror villains in gaming history. He dons the signature pyramid-shaped metal helmet, dressed like a butcher, ready to go on a rampage with his oversized great knife, being a monster conjured up from James's guilt and desire for punishment, a creature of vengeance born to seek justice. Being a boss which haunts you over the course of your journey, the first time you'll physically have to deal with him is in the courtyard of the Blue Creek Apartments, where he'll constantly pace towards you, swinging that massive knife around. It's a pretty narrow, cluttered space that you'll need to navigate through, littered with metal cages and rusted furniture, amping up the tension as he relentlessly hunts you down with devastating strikes. In this fight, all you basically need to do is survive his onslaught of attacks. Shooting him in that triangle dome is obviously going to be a bit futile, but hitting the body might at least shorten the time he'll chase you down. Pyramid Head gets faster and more aggressive as time ticks on, putting your dodging and spatial awareness to the test. But he's eventually going to get fed up with you, leaving as soon as an ominous siren blares out. He'll unexpectedly pop up and chase you at several points in the game, forcing you to run away and avoid being butchered by his beastly weapons. You'll have one final showdown with Pyramid Head right near the very end of your journey. Though if one of these guys wasn't bad enough, you'll now have to put up with 2 of them chasing you down, and with some really long spears. The jabbing attacks aren't quite as deadly as the blade strikes in the last fight, but they've got a hell of a lot more reach, plus these Pyramid Heads also walk a fair bit faster too, and with there now being 2 of them, you're much more likely to get skewered by those spears. Both of the bosses seem to share the same health pool, so just shoot at the one that happens to be the closest. And once you've dealt enough damage, the 2 Pyramid Heads are going to impale themselves on their own weapons, having fulfilled their purpose, no longer required to hunt James down, with him coming to terms with his past actions, choosing to face the truth rather than run away from it. So you've probably already noticed a couple of spoiler warnings pop up, but this is the big one. The final boss of the game, which is heavily tied to the story and its ending. Just to let you know. Well, James's reason for coming to Silent Hill in the first place is basically a sheer act of denial, with his mind quite literally fogged up by an impossible motive. There to find his dead wife Mary, despite knowing that she's already gone. He wasn't just summoned to the town to go on a wild goose chase, and its dark powers have only been able to torment him because he's been bottling up the truth all along. He was the one that killed Mary, and his overwhelming guilt has led him down this path of delusion. Silent Hill's supernatural powers have tested James along the way, manifesting a mysterious woman called Maria, who looks almost identical to his wife, but with practically opposite characteristics. Depending on your actions throughout the game, sort of decides who you'll face as the final boss, as although James's wife Mary is manifested at the end, this can also be Maria pretending to be Mary, using one last desperate trick to try and get James to stay with her. The outcome is always going to be the same though, as Mary doesn't want to be replaced and Maria doesn't want to be rejected, and whoever happens to be waiting on the hotel rooftop might affect the game's ending, but it won't affect the actual boss battle, always coming in the form of a twisted rendition of Mary getting thrown into a floated cage and morphed into a malevolent apparition, suspended upside down, engulfed by a load of evil black moths. She can use the good old vanishing trick that bosses like to do, phasing around the arena via the moth clouds she generates, with the swarms also seeking you down to attack, while you're distracted shooting at the boss. She'll also lash out with a long tendril-style appendage growing out from the back of her head, whipping it around and jabbing you with it as she hovers around you in chase. Eventually that metal cage is going to buckle, with the frame transforming into long, jagged spider-like legs, in a similar sort of way to the flesh lip, and you'll fall through the floor in a dark room below, continuing the fight in an area with much worse visibility. The monster's going to use a lot of the same tricks as before, only this time she'll move around in the ceiling, and drop down on you to strike from above. You'll need to keep dealing with those moth clouds by either hitting them or dodging, but apart from being in a spookier place, it's not really all that different to the first phase. Though once you've blasted her with enough firepower, the ceiling's going to completely fall through, bringing a lot more brightness back into the room, revealing the monster in its full form, crawling around the place, choosing to attack you head on. The boss is going to be a lot more aggressive in this stage, using a variety of different melee strikes and lunges, giving you more things to watch out for as she violently stabs and whacks you with those deadly metal limbs. Keep laying down the fire, and you'll eventually disable the frame that carries her, causing Mary to fall down, severely weakened by all your gunshots. One more bullet to the noggin's going to seal the deal, and the end of the story will play out, though in several possible ways, depending on your past choices. So those are all the enemy types and bosses in Silent Hill 2. Hope you enjoyed the guide. If you did, please remember to hit that like button, and subscribe if you want to see loads of other guides just like this right over on my channel. Thanks for watching guys, have a great day, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.